The small archive room smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, catching tiny motes in the air. Most people would have walked past it without a second thought. To the young researcher, though, it felt alive, almost like it was quietly holding its breath, waiting for someone curious enough to notice. The researcher had spent months working here, cataloging records, copying documents, and making sense of decades of forgotten information. The work was quiet, often repetitive, but it had its moments of excitement. Rarely among the piles of mundane forms and letters something would catch the eye, something that hinted at stories no one had told. That morning had started like any other. The researcher arrived, coffee in hand, careful not to spill a drop on the already crowded desk. The filing cabinet stretched along the walls, some labeled neatly, others with peeling tags that had faded over the years. There was a certain rhythm to the work, opening a drawer, flipping through papers, noting dates and references, and moving on. But today a single file slipped out in a way that felt different. It wasn't heavy or particularly old, but the label made the researcher pause. 3261, the faded numbers read. They were typed in black, slightly smudged, and the paper had a faintly shiny seal pressed into the top corner. It was nothing the researcher had seen before. Most files had simple numbers, often following clear sequences. But this one broke the pattern. Somehow it felt like a secret. Curiosity stirred, and the researcher carefully lifted the folder. Inside, the documents were in remarkable condition. The pages were crisp, though aged, and each sheet carried small handwritten notes in the margins. Some were almost illegible, written in hurried scrawls that seemed to hint at urgency. The researcher's eyes scanned the first few pages, noting the dates, locations, and brief descriptions. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary administrative notes. Then a small detail caught attention, a line of numbers that didn't fit the format of anything cataloged before. Another note referenced a person, someone who didn't appear in any of the local records. It was small, almost easy to miss, but for the researcher it was a spark. Hours passed without noticing. The researcher moved the files onto the desk, carefully examining each one. A pattern began to emerge. Not immediately obvious, but slowly, like a puzzle revealing itself. There were repeated codes, dates that seemed slightly off, and notes that hinted at meetings and events that had never been documented publicly. Some names appeared repeatedly, but no one could match them to official records. Each page brought new questions. Who wrote these? Why were they kept secret? And most puzzling of all, what was the purpose of 03261? The researcher leaned back in the chair, rubbing tired eyes. There was an odd mix of excitement and unease. Something about these documents felt bigger than a normal historical oversight. It wasn't just about missing records. It was about something intentionally hidden, something someone didn't want others to know. There was a story waiting to be uncovered, and the researcher could feel it in the way the pages were organized, the way the notes hinted at connections that didn't exist anywhere else. Lunch came and went without the researcher noticing. The small archive office was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of papers or a distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. Time seemed to stretch differently when completely absorbed. At one point, the researcher paused, glanced at the clock, and realized that the sun had moved across the sky more than expected. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the secrets quietly lying in that small room. With renewed focus, the researcher began to make detailed notes. Every name, every date, every unusual number was recorded. It was painstaking work, but essential. The more time spent with the files, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about administrative records. There were connections that, when mapped out, suggested events and actions that had never been publicly acknowledged. The researcher felt a mixture of awe and tension. On one hand, it was thrilling to feel like a detective discovering hidden truths. On the other, it was intimidating to think that these findings could shake long-standing assumptions. The deeper the researcher delved, the more peculiar the documents became. One page described a meeting in a small town with no recorded attendees. Another referenced a project with a vague description and no known records of completion. Yet another document hinted at correspondence between officials whose interactions were otherwise undocumented. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. The researcher felt the weight of responsibility settling in. It was clear that 3261 was deliberately hidden. Someone had gone to lengths to ensure it remained forgotten. Why, and what did it all mean? By late afternoon, the researcher had organized the files into piles, grouping similar entries together, marking pages with sticky notes for further examination. Every so often a note would stand out, one that seemed to speak directly to the person reading. It might have been a coincidence, or perhaps it was the way the human mind searched for meaning, but it felt like the files were guiding the researcher, offering hints that led deeper into the puzzle. A faint sense of unease began to creep in. The researcher realized that uncovering such information could have consequences. If these files revealed truths someone wanted buried, it was possible that the discovery would not be welcomed by everyone. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause to consider whether continuing this line of research was wise. But curiosity won. The feeling of standing on the edge of something significant was irresistible. As evening approached, the researcher carefully packed the files to take home. The thought of leaving them behind, even for a day, seemed impossible. There was a need to continue the work uninterrupted, to spend hours poring over each page in the quiet of home. The journey of discovery was just beginning. As the researcher walked out of the archive, the last rays of sunlight touched the building, casting long shadows across the street. There was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that the world was holding its breath alongside the researcher. At home, the files were spread across the dining table, each document carefully examined, cross-referenced, and annotated. The researcher worked late into the night, the hum of the city outside fading into background noise. Patterns became more distinct, codes slightly easier to decipher, and connections between names and events more apparent. The sense of uncovering a hidden layer of history was intoxicating. It was as if the researcher was walking through a secret door that only the brave and curious could open. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless. Dreams were filled with fragments of the documents, pieces of numbers, and fleeting images of people whose lives had been erased from official history. The mind worked even while the body rested, piecing together clues and forming questions that demanded answers. The researcher woke the next morning with renewed energy, determined to continue the investigation. There was an understanding, deep and unspoken, that this was only the beginning. 3261 was not just a set of files. It was a story waiting to be told, a truth hidden in plain sight. And the researcher, driven by curiosity, courage, and a sense of responsibility, had taken the first step into a world that promised wonder, mystery, and revelation. The morning light was soft and calm, brushing against the windows as the researcher returned to the dining table, now transformed into a workspace full of scattered papers, sticky notes, and scribbled observations. Every document of 3261 had been spread out, examined, and slowly began revealing small but significant patterns. There was something about the order of the notes and numbers that hinted at more than mere coincidence. Each page seemed to connect to the next in a subtle way, like puzzle pieces waiting to be fitted together. The researcher's eyes scanned a page again, following a series of numbers that appeared at the bottom of several sheets. They weren't ordinary dates or reference numbers, they seemed coded. It was the kind of code that required patience and careful thought, and the researcher felt a thrill at the challenge. Hours passed with pen in hand, marking correlations, drawing lines between points and occasionally leaning back to stare at the ceiling, imagining how these scattered pieces of paper could fit into the bigger picture. It became apparent that HOA 3261 was more than just old documents. The repeated codes, handwritten annotations, and cryptic references hinted at events that were deliberately hidden. One note mentioned a location, a small town far from the city seemingly unremarkable. Another referenced a figure who had never appeared in any public archives. The researcher began to feel that each discovery was part of a map, leading to something important. The idea was exciting, almost addictive. By midday, the researcher had started to organize the information into categories. Some documents clearly described meetings or correspondences. Others hinted at experiments, initiatives, or projects that seemed out of place. A few even suggested that powerful individuals were involved, although no one alive today had recorded evidence of their actions. Each layer uncovered more questions, and the researcher realized the significance of what was being held in their hands. Curiosity drove them to check every possible reference. The researcher opened digital archives, scanned public records, and even called a few libraries to confirm information. Slowly, discrepancies became clear. Events recorded officially didn't match up with the hidden notes in HOA 3261. Sometimes dates were shifted, names altered, or entire occurrences omitted. It became undeniable. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase or distort the history that HOA 3261 quietly preserved. It was thrilling and unsettling at the same time. The researcher felt like a detective uncovering a conspiracy, but without villains clearly defined. The intrigue wasn't in danger or crime alone. It was in the secrecy, in the erasure of truth, and in the silent stories of people who had been forgotten. With each page, the researcher began to feel the weight of responsibility. These documents were not meant for casual discovery. They were meant to be hidden, yet here they were, fragile and tangible in someone's hands. Hours turned into evening, but the researcher refused to stop. The quiet of the apartment, the soft hum of the city outside, and the stillness of the room created a perfect space for deep thought. Each new connection brought a jolt of excitement, a sense of standing closer to something hidden from everyone else. The researcher carefully noted every pattern, every oddity, and every recurring number. Slowly, it began to form a map of relationships, events, and possibilities. One document referenced a date that seemed unimportant at first, a day that had passed in the newspapers with little notice. But when cross-checked with other documents, it became clear that something unusual had happened. A meeting had taken place, not recorded publicly, with participants who were never listed in any official record. Other pages mentioned actions taken quietly, decisions made in private, and communications erased from history. The researcher felt the thrill of discovery deepen. Each detail made the story richer and more intricate, and yet each revelation raised even more questions. The researcher paused to think about the people behind the notes. Who had written them? Were they part of a larger organization, or working alone to document events they knew would be forgotten? The handwriting varied, suggesting more than one person. Some notes were hurried and chaotic, others meticulous and careful. It became clear that multiple individuals had contributed to 03261, each leaving a piece of the story. The thought fascinated the researcher, imagining the lives of these people who had worked in shadows, knowing their actions would be unseen by history. As night fell, the researcher lit a small desk lamp, the warm glow highlighting the scattered papers. Patterns became more defined, and the mind raced with possibilities. Some codes were solved, revealing simple numerical sequences that corresponded to dates or locations. Others remained frustratingly obscure, tantalizingly out of reach. The researcher realized that this was not a short investigation. 03261 was complex, multi-layered, and would require time, patience, and careful thought to fully understand. Despite the challenge, the researcher felt a sense of purpose. The discovery of 03261 was not just an academic exercise. It was an opportunity to uncover forgotten truths, to give voice to people and events that had been deliberately silenced. The researcher imagined the stories behind the hidden pages, decisions made in secret rooms, people working tirelessly without recognition, and consequences that rippled through time unseen. There was a human story at the heart of the documents, one that demanded to be told. The next day brought new energy. The researcher decided to create a chart, connecting all the names, dates, and locations found in 03261. Lines were drawn between seemingly unrelated notes, and slowly the map began to reveal clusters of activity. Meetings, projects, and interactions started to make sense in a way they had not before. Patterns that were invisible on individual pages became clear when viewed together. It was as if the documents themselves were speaking, revealing the hidden web of connections carefully maintained by their original authors. The researcher felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was more than a simple investigation. There were implications that reached beyond the immediate findings. If these discoveries were shared, they could challenge assumptions, question accepted narratives, and even create discomfort for those who preferred the past remain untouched. The researcher wrestled with the decision. To continue digging meant uncovering truth, but it also carried unknown consequences. Curiosity, however, was stronger than fear. Days turned into a week, and the researcher became consumed by 03261. Every free moment was spent analyzing, cross-referencing, and imagining the stories behind the notes. Friends began to notice the obsession, though few understood it. Calls and messages were often delayed or ignored, and social life receded into the background. But the researcher felt it was necessary. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that 03261 was a carefully constructed record, deliberately hidden and full of truths waiting to be uncovered. One evening, as the researcher traced a particularly confusing set of numbers, a realization struck. Certain sequences were coordinates pointing to places not mentioned in public records. Others were dates connected to incidents that had been brushed over in newspapers. Slowly, a picture began to form of events that had been intentionally obscured, of people whose roles had been erased, and of actions that had shaped communities without recognition. The feeling was dizzying, as if history itself was being lifted to reveal hidden layers. The researcher also discovered small personal notes hidden in the margins. Some were simple observations, others expressed frustration or urgency. It was clear that whoever had written them understood the importance of what they were documenting. These notes humanized the documents, showing not just hidden events but the people who worked to preserve memory against the tide of forgetfulness. For the researcher, this was the most compelling part, the sense of connection to individuals who lived decades earlier, whose efforts had almost been lost entirely. As the night deepened, the researcher stepped back from the table, eyes tired but mind buzzing. Every piece of information suggested that 03261 was only the beginning. The documents were a doorway into something larger, a story that had been buried carefully and quietly, waiting for someone willing to follow the trail. The anticipation of what might come next was both thrilling and intimidating. Finally, the researcher closed the last folder for the night, careful to keep everything in order. 3261 was no longer just a file. It was a mystery demanding patience, creativity, and courage. The researcher felt a deep sense of responsibility, aware that what had been uncovered was precious, fragile, and significant. There was excitement, yes, but also a recognition that the journey had just begun. Somewhere in those hidden codes and faded notes lay stories that could change understanding, reveal forgotten truths, and honor people long overlooked. The researcher went to bed, but sleep was elusive. Dreams were filled with numbers, coordinates, and blurred faces. The mind worked even while the body rested, connecting dots and forming questions. Each dream seemed to whisper possibilities, as if the files themselves were speaking across time, urging the researcher to continue. When morning arrived, the researcher returned to the dining table, ready to take the next step. The first part of 3261 had been unraveled, but the story was far from complete. There were more documents, more codes, more mysteries waiting to be explored. The anticipation was like standing on the edge of a vast hidden world, ready to step in and discover what had been carefully hidden from view for decades. The days that followed were unlike anything the researcher had experienced before. The quiet rhythm of daily life had been replaced with a restless curiosity that refused to fade. Every waking moment was spent thinking about 3261, its strange codes, missing details, and the invisible threads that connected one piece of information to another. What began as curiosity had now become something deeper, almost personal. The researcher felt drawn to it as if the documents were alive, whispering for their truth to be heard. One evening, after hours of reviewing notes, the researcher noticed something new. A single phrase had been repeated in several documents, almost hidden among the lines. The handwriting was faint, and the words had been written in the margin rather than the body of the text. The phrase read, "The record must survive." It appeared again and again like a quiet plea from the past. The researcher leaned closer, tracing the letters with a finger, wondering what it meant. Was it written by the same person who compiled the files, or had it been added later by someone else who understood their importance? The more the researcher thought about it, the more the phrase began to feel like a message meant for them. If the record had survived this long, perhaps it was waiting for someone to ensure it reached the world. That thought brought both excitement and fear. There was still so much that didn't make sense. Too many missing pieces, too many blank spaces between the lines. The only way forward was to keep digging. Over the next few days, the researcher focused on decoding a set of numbers that had appeared repeatedly in the documents. They weren't simple sequences. Each one seemed to point toward a date or location, but the connections were too inconsistent to confirm. Frustration grew, but so did determination. The researcher decided to test a new approach, to treat the codes as coordinates. Using online maps and historical records, They began comparing the numbers to places that existed decades ago. To their surprise, one of he coordinates pointed to a small town a few hours away. It was the same town that had been mentioned once before in the documents. A quiet place few people paid attention to. The researcher sat back, staring at the screen, heartbeat quickening. Maybe this was more than coincidence. Maybe that town held the missing link to what 03261 was trying to reveal. The idea of visiting the place felt both thrilling and intimidating. It would mean stepping beyond papers and numbers into the real world, searching for clues left behind in buildings, streets, or memories of people who might still live there. The researcher packed a small bag, gathered printed copies of the most relevant documents, and set out the next morning. The drive was long and quiet. The road stretched between fields and small clusters of houses, the kind of countryside that seemed to stand still in time. As the researcher approached the town, the air felt different, not heavy or dark, just strangely still. There was a sense of history here, of lives that had moved at their own quiet pace. The town itself was small, with a few shops, a single church, and a main street that curved gently toward a park. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance, but the researcher knew that appearances could hide stories, and this place had been mentioned too many times to ignore. The first stop was the local library, an old building with creaking floors and shelves lined with yellowed books and records. Inside, an elderly librarian greeted the researcher kindly, curious about the visit. When the researcher explained they were doing historical research about an old set of files marked 03261, the librarian paused. Her expression changed slightly, almost not fear, but recognition. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, and said quietly, "You're not the first to ask about that number." The researcher felt a chill. Someone else was looking for it? The librarian nodded slowly. A long time ago, but they stopped coming. Never said why. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you're serious about this, you might want to check the old town records. Some were moved to the basement years ago." With her guidance, the researcher descended the narrow stairs into the basement. The air was cool and smelled of old paper. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, each labeled by year. After hours of searching, one box stood out. Its label faded but still legible. 03261, miscellaneous. Heart pounding, the researcher carefully opened it. Inside were several folders, some crumbling at the edges. They contained letters, photographs, and brief reports, most dated decades ago. Many bore the same seal that had appeared on the original documents. This was no coincidence. These files were part of the same mystery. The photographs showed people standing outside a building that no longer existed. The report spoke of a project, unnamed, classified, and abruptly terminated. The researchers' hands trembled as they flipped through the pages. Whatever this project was, it had been erased from official records but preserved quietly here. The pieces were starting to fit together. Among the papers was a letter, handwritten and fragile. It was signed only with initials, but the message was clear. "If you find this, protect it." They wanted it gone, but truth has a way of returning. Those words echoed in the researcher's mind for the rest of the day. Whoever wrote that letter had known the importance of these files. They had hidden them not to conceal wrongdoing, but to ensure that the truth would one day be found by someone willing to see it. By the time the researcher left the library, the sun had dipped low behind the trees. The drive home was quiet, filled with thoughts about the discovery. It was no longer just about curiosity or academic interest. It felt like a responsibility now, a duty to protect what had been uncovered and to understand why it had been hidden. Back home, the researcher laid out the new findings on the table. The connection between the two sets of documents was undeniable. Both sets carried the same codes, the same seal, and similar handwriting. The project mentioned in the town's records aligned perfectly with dates in the 03261 files. Slowly, the outline of a hidden story began to form. But as the night deepened, something unexpected happened. The researcher received an email from an unknown address. The subject line was simple and stop. There was no message, no signature, just that single word. For a long moment, the researcher stared at the screen, unsure what to think. It could have been a coincidence, a prank, or something more serious. The timing, though, was too perfect to ignore. The next morning, a sense of unease lingered. The researcher went about daily tasks but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow slightly longer. Still, curiosity won again. There was no turning back now. Too much had been uncovered to stop. In the following days, the researcher focused on organizing the new material. Notes were typed out, cross-referenced, and connected with the older documents. The full scope of the HOA 3261 findings was growing clearer. It was evident that a group of people had worked on something significant, something that had been silenced deliberately. Yet what stood out most wasn't the secrecy itself. It was the courage of those who had tried to preserve the truth. The researcher felt a strange sense of connection to them, even though they had lived decades apart. It was as if their message had crossed time and found its way into the hands of someone who understood what they were trying to do. Each page read felt like a quiet conversation with the past. As night fell again, the researcher sat by the window looking out into the stillness of the street. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily but not unpleasantly. There was pride in knowing the truth had not been lost completely, and determination to bring it forward carefully, respectfully, and truthfully. The phrase, "the record must survive," echoed again in the mind, softer this time but filled with meaning. The researcher knew now that this work was more than a task. It was a mission to ensure that what had been hidden would finally be seen, not for fame or recognition, but for the sake of truth itself. The faint hum of the city outside grew quieter as the night deepened. The lamp's glow fell softly on the pages of HOA 3261, the lines of ink casting shadows like threads connecting past and present. The story was still incomplete, but the path ahead was becoming clearer. There were still unanswered questions, missing pieces, and the constant hum of uncertainty, but the researcher felt stronger than before. This was no longer about discovering something mysterious. It was about preserving something that mattered. And though the journey was far from over, the researcher knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been hidden under the name 03261 had survived time, silence, and secrecy for a reason. And now, it had found the right person to bring it into the light. The morning began quietly, but the air in the apartment felt heavy. The researcher sat at the same table that had now become a permanent place of discovery. The documents from HOA 3261 lay neatly in piles, each marked and labeled, but the atmosphere had changed. The strange email from the unknown sender still lingered in the researcher's thoughts. It wasn't a long message, just a single word: stop. Yet that word had power. It carried warning, maybe even threat. But curiosity doesn't stop easily. The researcher had come too far to turn back now. For days, the researcher stayed cautious. They kept to a routine, checked for strange activity, and avoided mentioning HOA 3261 to anyone. Yet something deep inside refused to be silent. The truth waiting inside those pages was too important to ignore. Every time the researcher looked at the phrase, "the record must survive," it felt like a personal call to keep going, to not let fear decide the outcome. That night, the researcher decided to dig deeper into the new material found in the town's library basement. Some of the older papers mentioned a phase project, always written in capital letters, never fully explained. Other files connected to it spoke about trials, fieldwork, and adjustments. The wording was vague but consistent, as if the people who wrote it had been careful to avoid leaving full details. It was as if they were protecting themselves from being exposed. Among those papers was a list, handwritten, uneven, but still readable. It contained several names, all of which were marked with a single red line drawn through them. Next to some names, small notes had been added, such as moved, gone, or transferred. The researcher couldn't help but wonder what those notes meant. Were these people employees, witnesses, or perhaps the ones who had hidden the truth in the first place? As the researcher studied the pages, a pattern became visible. Each name on the list matched a place or event mentioned in another part of the file. The researcher began to map it all out again, spreading pages across the floor. Soon a clear trail emerged. Not random, not scattered, but leading to something intentional. Every clue seemed to point toward a single organization that no longer existed in public records. It had been dissolved quietly with no explanation. The deeper the researcher went, the more it felt like stepping through layers of forgotten time. Reports spoke about small groups meeting secretly, about sudden changes in policy, and about projects that disappeared before completion. Some notes even hinted that the events were connected to bigger decisions made by those in power at the time. Nothing was written directly, but the tone of the letters and the way the words were chosen revealed worry, maybe even guilt. The more the researcher learned, the more a strange feeling grew. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Someone had spent years keeping this quiet, and now someone was watching again. Small things began to happen. A folder that had been left on the table was slightly out of place in the morning. The researcher's laptop once restarted on its own. At first these seemed like coincidences, but soon they became too frequent to ignore. Still, stopping wasn't an option. The researcher began working late into the night, using old articles, government archives, and digital databases to cross-check facts. It was slow work, but piece by piece a hidden truth began to form. The 3261 documents weren't just about a single event. They covered a span of years, a whole era where decisions were made behind closed doors, decisions that changed people's lives without anyone knowing. One evening, as the researcher studied another faded letter, a realization struck. The document mentioned 03261 operations, not as a file name but as a project title. The meaning shifted entirely. 261 wasn't just an archive code. It was the identifier of a secret operation, and the files the researcher had found were the surviving records of it. That explained the secrecy, the erased data, and the hidden boxes buried in forgotten basements. Excitement mixed with unease. If 03261 was an operation, it meant that what had been discovered was never meant for public eyes. The researcher sat still for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. The world outside continued as usual, but inside that small apartment everything had changed. The truth had finally revealed its shape, and it was larger than anyone could have guessed. The following morning, the researcher decided to reach out for advice. An old professor from university came to mind, someone known for studying hidden histories and lost records. After careful thought, the researcher sent a brief message avoiding details, simply asking to meet. The reply came hours later, a short note agreeing to meet at a quiet cafe the next day. When they met, the researcher spoke carefully, describing only the general discovery. An old file, coded 03261, possibly connected to forgotten events. The professor listened quietly, eyes narrowing slightly as details unfolded. When the researcher mentioned the strange warning email, the professor grew serious. "This isn't unusual," the professor said softly. "Sometimes when people dig too deep, they uncover things that powerful hands once tried to bury. Be careful. But if you're sure of what you found, document everything. Make copies. Keep them safe." The researcher nodded. It was reassuring to hear understanding, even if it came with caution. After the meeting, determination grew stronger. The advice was simple but wise: protect the evidence no matter what. That night, the researcher scanned every document, saving digital copies on multiple drives. Each file was carefully labeled, encrypted, and backed up. The originals were stored in sealed folders hidden away from sight. For the first time in weeks, the researcher felt a small sense of control. Whatever 3261 truly was, it would not disappear again. In the days that followed, progress accelerated. The researcher's notes filled entire notebooks now, with arrows connecting times, places, and people. The picture that emerged was astonishing. 03261 had been a special research initiative decades ago, one that had started with good intentions but ended in silence. The documents hinted at discoveries that had been controversial at the time, possibly involving political, scientific, or social implications too large for the public to accept. Rather than face exposure, those responsible had buried everything, destroying traces and erasing records, or at least trying to. Now, years later, the evidence had resurfaced. It had survived storms, neglect, and silence, and found its way into the hands of someone determined to understand it. The researcher realized that they were not just uncovering information, they were restoring lost truth. Yet even as progress continued, strange events persisted. Late one night, the researcher noticed a black car parked near the building, its engine idling. It could have been nothing, a random passerby, but it stayed longer than felt natural. The researcher closed the curtains and tried to focus on the work, reminding themselves not to let fear take over. Instead, energy was poured into finishing what had been started. The final goal was clear now: to organize everything into a report that could be shared with the world. The researcher worked tirelessly, writing summaries, double-checking facts, and compiling visual evidence. It was slow and tiring, but deeply satisfying. The more complete the picture became, the more powerful the truth appeared. At one point, exhaustion caught up and the researcher fell asleep at the table. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the curtains and the room felt strangely peaceful. The documents lay where they had been left, waiting patiently. The work was nearing completion. By evening, the researcher sat staring at the laptop screen, reading through the compiled notes. The final report told a story of hidden operations, forgotten efforts, and people who had tried to protect truth in silence. It was not a story of villains and heroes, but of human complexity, fear, courage, and the timeless battle between truth and secrecy. The phrase, "the record must survive," returned again in memory, clearer than ever. Now the researcher understood its meaning. Those words were written not as fear, but as hope, a message for someone in the future to find, to protect, and to continue what others could not finish. As the night deepened, the researcher saved the final draft and leaned back. The journey had been long and uncertain, but the pieces finally fit together. 03261 was no longer just a mystery. It was a story of endurance, proof that truth can survive even the longest silence. Still, a final question remained. What to do next? Should the findings be shared openly or handled carefully to avoid unwanted attention? The researcher knew that revealing the truth could change lives and challenge old narratives. But it could also bring new risks. For now, the decision could wait. What mattered most was that 03261 was no longer buried. The record had survived, and the one who found it had done what was asked, protected it, studied it, and ensured it would never be forgotten again. The researcher turned off the lamp and stood quietly for a moment. Outside, the city was calm, unaware of the secret that had just been uncovered within one small apartment. Somewhere, perhaps others still tried to hide the past, but for the first time the truth had a chance to breathe again. The feeling wasn't triumph, it was peace. A quiet understanding that knowledge once found cannot easily be silenced. The researcher smiled faintly and whispered into the still room, as if speaking to those who had written the notes decades ago. The record survived. I found it, and in that silence, it felt like the room itself answered, not in words, but in a deep, calm certainty that some truths are stronger than time, stronger than fear, and strong enough to find their way back into the light. The morning light spilled softly across the table where the researcher had spent countless hours. Stacks of papers, notebooks filled with scribbles, and a laptop that had become almost a part of their existence now sat still. Everything was quiet except for the faint hum of life outside. Cars passed, birds sang, and somewhere a child laughed. But inside, a single thought echoed. What now? The work was finished. Every line, every note, every cross-check was complete. The story of 03261 had been uncovered, cleaned of dust and stitched together like a puzzle that had waited years for someone to solve it. But what to do with it was the hardest question yet. Sharing it might bring attention, not just to the truth, but to the one who revealed it. Keeping it secret would mean betraying the purpose of the message. The record must survive. The researcher sat quietly, sipping cold coffee, eyes lost in thought. There was a sense of satisfaction, but also weight. This wasn't just information. It was history. People had risked everything to hide it, or to preserve it. Either way, the responsibility now rested in one pair of hands. Later that day, the researcher decided to take a walk. Sometimes answers come when the mind isn't trying too hard to find them. The streets were calm, filled with the ordinary rhythm of life. No one could have guessed that in one small apartment nearby, a secret from decades ago had just resurfaced. The researcher walked through the park, watched people feed birds, and felt something shift. A quiet reminder of why truth matters. It isn't for fame or attention, it's for people. For all those who live unaware of how much of the world around them was shaped by hidden hands. That evening, while the sun set and painted the sky in soft gold and pink, the researcher made a decision. The truth wouldn't stay locked away anymore, but it wouldn't be released carelessly either. It needed to be shared wisely, through the right channel, in a way that protected both the evidence and the legacy behind it. The researcher spent the next few days preparing everything. Each file was checked again, labeled and stored on multiple encrypted drives. A detailed summary was written, telling the story of 03261 in simple, clear words. Not technical, not dramatic, just honest. The idea was not to shock the world, but to show it something real, something human. When the report was ready, the researcher reached out to a small independent journalist known for honest, careful reporting. The message was simple. I have something important. Not dangerous, but bury. Edit deserves light. The reply came hours later. Let's meet. Bring nothing digital, just talk. They met in a quiet cafe, the kind where no one pays much attention. The journalist listened closely as the researcher spoke. There were no grand claims, no conspiracy talk, just facts, documents, and a story that had been hidden too long. The journalist didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly, eyes focused. After nearly 2 hours, the journalist finally said, "If this is real, it changes a lot. But you've done the hard part already. You found it. Now it's about telling it right." The researcher smiled faintly. That was exactly what was needed. Telling it right. Over the following weeks, the journalist worked with the researcher carefully. They verified the documents, checked dates, confirmed details. Everything matched. Even the smallest notes lined up with old government records and newspaper clippings. The truth was undeniable. When the story was finally ready for publication, they both knew it would stir attention. But no one could have predicted the reaction it received. Within hours of release, it spread across social media. Headlines read, "Long-lost files reveal forgotten Operation 03261, truth buried for decades." People were stunned. The story wasn't about scandal or blame. It was about courage, secrecy, and how far some had gone to keep vital discoveries quiet. It showed the human side of hidden history, the fear, the guilt, and the hope that someone someday would uncover it again. The world wanted to know more. News outlets requested interviews. Historians began analyzing the data. Debate started in online forums and classrooms. Some were skeptical, some amazed, but everyone was talking. The phrase 03261 findings became a symbol of truth resurfacing after silence. For the researcher, it was overwhelming. The quiet life had turned into a blur of calls, messages, and requests. Yet in the middle of it all, a quiet joy remained. Not pride, but peace. The kind that comes from doing something right. The record hadn't just survived. It had spoken again, but there was more. As people read through the published documents, they discovered personal letters, diaries, and fragments written by those who had been part of the original operation. These writings revealed their inner struggles, the doubts, the late nights, and the heavy burden of knowing truths they could not share. Many readers were moved. The humanity behind the files touched hearts everywhere. One letter in particular spread widely online. It read, "If our words are ever found, I hope they remind someone that truth isn't meant to die in darkness. Even if we cannot speak it, someone someday will." That single line became quoted in speeches, printed on posters, and shared by millions. The researcher watched all this unfold quietly. They avoided interviews, staying out of the spotlight. The work had never been about recognition. It had always been about the truth, and about honoring those who came before. Still, people began calling the researcher the Finder, a name that somehow felt right. Then something unexpected happened. Universities, historians, and even government archives began reopening similar cases. Inspired by 03261, they started reviewing other forgotten files, restoring old data, and re-examining events that had been lost to time. A small discovery had sparked a larger movement toward transparency. It wasn't about uncovering secrets for drama, but about understanding the past to build a better future. Months passed and the attention slowly settled. The world moved on to new topics, but 03261 remained a part of history now, preserved in museums, studied in research papers, and remembered as the discovery that showed how truth, no matter how hidden, can find its way back. One rainy evening, the researcher visited the same library basement where it had all begun. The dusty shelves looked the same. The air was still cool and quiet. Standing there, the researcher ran a hand along the old boxes and smiled. This place, forgotten by time, had become the birthplace of revelation. As the rain tapped gently against the windows, the researcher whispered softly, "You made it. You're free now." Leaving the basement, the researcher felt lighter. There was nothing more to chase, no mystery left unsolved. Just gratitude. For the journey, for the message, and for the people who had left clues across decades. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal. The researcher went back to quiet routines, morning walks, reading, and long evenings with tea and notes. Sometimes, messages still arrived from people around the world thanking them for bringing 03261 to light. Some shared how the story inspired them to seek truth in their own ways, through art, history, or even personal reflection. The researcher never replied to most messages, but always read them with care. It was comforting to know that the work had reached hearts, not just headlines. Then, one morning, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a single note that read, "You did what we couldn't. Thank you." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting looked strangely familiar, similar to the old notes from the original 03261 files. The researcher held it for a long moment, a soft smile forming. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe somehow someone connected to the past had seen their work and wanted to say one final thank you. Either way, it felt like closure. As time went on, the researcher continued studying forgotten records, not for fame but for understanding. The story of 03261 had taught a lasting lesson, that truth doesn't belong to time or power. It belongs to those brave enough to protect it. Years later, when the researcher grew older and stories of new discoveries filled the world, one of the last entries in their journal read, "The record must survive not just on paper but in people. As long as someone remembers, it lives." That final note was later found by students who admired the researcher's work. They framed it, along with a copy of the 03261 files, as a reminder of what curiosity, courage, and persistence can do. And so, long after the researcher was gone, the story continued to live, not as a mystery anymore, but as a legacy. A tale of one ordinary person who followed a trail of forgotten papers and ended up reminding the world that truth, once found, becomes eternal somewhere. The dust in that old library still rests over new secrets, waiting for someone else to look closer. Maybe someday another curious soul will stumble upon a file number or a note, feel that same spark of wonder, and begin the journey again. Because that's how truth works. It never ends. It waits. And somewhere in the quiet of history's endless halls it whispers, "Find me."